Today, I'd speak with Eric B. Schnurer about his most recent essay, Democracy Disrupted. With modern technology leading to massive disaggregation and decentralization, governments no longer have exclusive hold over the territory that defines their borders. The implications of this are staggering. My guest today is Eric B. Schnurer. He has a lifelong record of public service and expertise on government. He has spent his career working to improve government efficiency, challenging corruption and abuse of power, both as a public prosecutor and as a private public interest lawyer. He is a founder and president of Public Works LLC, specializing in improving government management, policy, and efficiency, as well as the Greater Good Initiative, which features an annual conference on the future of technology and the public good. I bring you my conversation with Eric Schnurer. Hello, Inquirers. A quick note before today's podcast for Inquiry. The Centre for Inquiry Canada is a proud sponsor of BajaCon, the Blue Water Atheists, Humanists, and Agnostics Conference, happening in Sarnia, Ontario on August 26th through 28th, 2022. I will be going, and you can too by registering at bluewateraha.com. I hope to see you there. And now, today's PFI episode. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers? We have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Eric Schnurer, thank you for joining me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for having me aboard.
I read your essay, Democracy Disrupted, a couple of weeks ago, and it's so full to bursting with ideas. It kind of blew my mind. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Can you provide us with a summary of its thesis?
Well, I can try. I was thinking that's probably the most difficult question you'll ask me the whole morning, since, as you indicated, it's a fairly long piece, and I tried to cover a good amount of ground. But let me start with the beginning, and we can talk through however you want to talk it through. Basically, the starting point is that the world's kind of a mess these days in most people's view, and I want to explain that. And there are a lot of explanations out there, all of which I think are very good explanations. But I think that there's an underlying factor that's longer term and deeper and driving a lot of why we see what we see going on in the world today, particularly in politics and government, but in a lot of other ways. And that's basically that I think we're living through an era of technological change that will be looked back on someday as of a magnitude of like the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution, with the major difference being that this transition and this major upheaval and everything that comes with it is happening in the span of maybe a few decades, where most of these other major technological world historical changes have occurred over periods of centuries or longer. So that's very disruptive of everything in everybody's life. In some ways, that creates all kinds of advantages, and in lots of other ways, that's upsetting and causes a lot of backlash. The kind of second piece of the thesis, and I'll leave it at that, is that the kind of technology that you see dominate in each era affects how we think, how we live in all sorts of ways, and that the nature of the digital technology that is coming to dominate our world today is, as I say in the piece, it's disaggregative, which basically means its nature is to break things apart and to basically individuate everything, and that undermines authority, the nature of truth and meaning in all sorts of ways, that has implications for everything from politics, how we govern our society, how those societies interact on a global basis, to everybody's daily life.
can you spend a moment to get into a little bit more why you think that what we are experiencing now is on the scale of these major events that have shaped the our species over thousands of years or hundreds of years in the case of the Industrial Revolution?
Sure, or years, just in this case, I think.
Yes.
I think you can already see how technologies today are changing and disrupting most things in life. Starting maybe 30 years ago, you started seeing the internet undermining most of the major incumbents in many industries, starting with information intensive industries, but it spread um, to industries whose main output is ostensibly physical. So, like the largest lodging company in the world today is Airbnb, which hardly owns any real estate. The largest transportation company in the world today is Uber, which doesn't own any cars. Um, so this is a fundamental shift, and you can go on and on lots of other areas of life like that. But when you think about that, that's something that's very, very different, and it affects not just the Uber companies like Uber, but just individuals who can do things today that we couldn't imagine most people doing 30, 40, 50 years ago, where you can start a business out of your home, say, baking muffins, and sell your muffins to a worldwide audience, not just to the people down the street. So one effect of these technologies is to really undermine place, location, geography as an important determinant of economic activity, social relations. I mean, here you and I are having a conversation in a way that we're getting kind of used to from, I don't know, 800 miles apart or something. And uh, it's not just conversations and information flow that's getting less localized and more devoid or divorced from geography, but physical goods as well. And that's in a lot of ways, a an evolutionary, not a revolutionary change from the way the world has more or less progressed for the last couple of hundred years. But in other ways, it's such a large and dramatic and quickly moving change that I think it goes beyond the evolutionary to the revolutionary.
Your piece is not entirely negative, but or pessimistic, but there's a lot of warnings in there. There's a lot of ways in which the changes that we're undergoing could go wrong, and you outline some of them, but this dissolving of distance for information and to a lesser but still considerable extent physical goods is a good thing. I think, and certainly the rhetoric of the internet from 30 years ago and over 25 years ago, where information wants to be free, where I'm not constrained living in where I am to the ideas and to the people in my immediate community. I have access uh, to thinkers like yourself or around the world, whatever I'm interested in learning. We have not just libraries, which were tremendous fount of information, but you have access to really anything that anyone is finding out or thinking or writing anywhere in the world. And in
Right.
principle, you can have instant access to this and being able to access goods that are produced from anywhere and not just locally. All of this would seem to be beneficial and have an additive effect to not just individuals but to societies. But you your essay comes with several warnings. So why is this not as simple as the naive picture that I have just outlined for you?
Well, for one thing, I think most people today wouldn't outline the picture that you just outlined, and I'm glad you brought up about how in the early internet age, say 30 years ago, up until maybe 20 years ago, uh, information wants to be free and so forth. Was this very optimistic view on the internet and on virtual technologies and so forth, and it was going to transform the world in all kinds of wonderful ways, and everybody was going to have friends, and we'd have perfect knowledge, and it would bring about peace on earth. But now everybody thinks that the internet is the death of freedom. It's tearing us apart. It's horrible in every way. And part of my argument, I don't make this quite as explicitly, but I think it's important to realize that um, neither of those views is probably right. Uh, it, I think most people think things are falling apart today because of social media, and we've got to find a way to stomp them out. I think that's as unrealistic as the view in the early days of the internet that this was going to end all enemy and all disputes over truth, and we were all going to live in happiness. Neither of those views are correct. The truth, like just about everything else in human life, is probably somewhere in between, and that goes to something I spent a good amount of time on in the beginning of the piece, which is this dispute over technological determinism. There's a lot of scholarly talk these days about how we're inevitably headed towards an authoritarian world because that's the nature of these technologies. Now, everybody was saying the opposite 30 years ago. The internet was going to free China. I think the point is that no technology is inherently authoritarian or libertarian. Technologies are what we make of them. And I go through a number of technologies from ancient history, basically, to show how they can be both centralizing and decentralizing. And at different times in history, the same technologies have led to centralization of authority and more repressive regimes, and in other cases to decentralization of authority and less repressive regimes. So, I don't think you can say that any kind of technology or technological moment is inherently something. These are tools that we use, and we use them for better or worse. So, should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? Well, I think we should be cautious, and we have decisions to make. And if you take anything away from the piece, I think that would be it. It's not meant to be happy or sad, although I think I do work in the end to try to make it a little bit uplifting, because
Mhm.
I find, as the closing vignette in the piece says, most of my friends think my writing is horribly depressing, and I I, I don't think it is at all. I say that, but I don't think it is. And this piece, because it's much more focused on much more focused than things I've written before on what's this. What does this mean down the road? What are things going to look like in the future? And I think that I think we're in for some tough times in the years ahead. Down the road, like our children's lives, I think will be significantly better.
In your essay, Eric, you write that if we want to avoid a dystopian future, and I'm going to quote a couple of things from your essay.
Okay.
We need renewed traditional antitrust enforcement, including prohibitions on buying out competing technologies and models. And then elsewhere in the essay, you write, we need to make sure that all the surplus value isn't absorbed by the owners of capital and then hoarded. Now, I fully agree with these points. My question to you is, how do we avoid this? I want to get into how these decentralizing technologies, or how the internet weakens government hold over people living in its territory, because that's, I think, really important. And we'll get to that. But when governments are increasingly impotent to regulate, and corporations can play regulatory arbitrage, simply reincorporating in a jurisdiction with weak or non-existent antitrust enforcement. How can we constrain corporations from gobbling up their competitors and ensuring that the surplus isn't hoarded by the owners?
Well, in some ways, the two sentences that you chose out of the 50,000 or so sentences in the piece, in some ways they aren't representative of the piece, and particularly that I think that they represent a particular point of view that I'm guessing a lot of your listeners would sympathize with, but that I think is problematic because I think it's part of what's passing into the past. This isn't an argument I make in the piece so much, but to me, what we call progressivism, at least here in the United States, has kind of ceased making progress since about 40 years ago, which I find kind of ironic. And it's kind of a throwback ideology. If we can just get back to the days before Reagan and Thatcher ruined everything, then everything will be fine, which to me is an inherently backwards looking uh, uh, kind of ideology where my my basic point would be that the world is changing so dramatically that if you want to think about what the future should look like, it's one thing to cling to values, it's another thing to cling to specific policies as a way to address them. And the first line that you quoted about antitrust, I believe in antitrust laws very strongly. I think there's a real problem that we have with the concentration of um, not just power, but the nature of innovation in a few large companies. Um, you know, I was just talking with, I have a consulting firm. I was talking with one of my employees just in the past week about how, the Microsoft Word is a highly problematic program to use. If you remember back in the good old days, 30 or so years ago, there was a word processing program called Word Perfect that I just loved.
I
Everybody
remember it well. I used it a lot.
everybody loves Word Perfect. Microsoft bought it out and put it out of its misery. What they should have at least put Microsoft Word out of its misery and kept Word Perfect. But they bought out a better competitor who was smaller and deep sixed it, and now we're all stuck with Microsoft Word. So that inhibits the advance of technology, and inhibits consumer value and so forth. So, I would like to see more stringent antitrust laws, and both sides of the aisle in Washington now, for different reasons, are kind of coalescing around that. I think that's a good thing, but if you read the rest of the just that section that line is taken from, it's part of a larger discussion that basically amounts to we should do that, but let's do it while we can, because we're not really going to be able to do anything about that in the future. Because as you alluded to, I think that governments as we know it are going to have decreasing control over everybody and everything. And the idea of making progress through governmental action is probably not the way that we're going to achieve progress and better outcomes for humanity in a couple of decades from now, because government is weakening in that way. And part of that, I think, I come back to a lot the differences between, I'm guessing you're roughly my age, people our age, and college age kids today, who I think have grown up breathing this different world in a way that we didn't, and we might be able to see it, but they live it. And as the piece talks about at the end, there's really nothing about this that surprises or frightens young people. But I find people our age find this piece, as well as other stuff I've written, to be rather disturbing. But if you look at the career choices that young people are making, people who are idealistic, and there's plenty of them. I have a lot of faith in the younger generation in the future. There's a lot of people, I think more so than in the baby boom generation, who really want to make the world better for humanity. And if you look at the career choices they're making, they're, when you're my age, when I was their age, if you wanted to go make a difference, what are you going to do? A lot of us wanted to be lawyers. A lot of people wanted to go into politics and government. No young person today is making that choice. And there's a reason for that. Those are not the ways to make a positive difference in the next generation. And I think young people today inherently sense that. They're finding other ways to make a difference and to make the world better. And it's not through uh, public service and government action as we have known it in our generation, because those things are fading away, and they know that.
Let's talk about governments and how technologies are in your view eroding their power and sphere of influence. And I want to start with Estonia, because you mentioned Estonia 5 times in Democracy Disrupted. You say it is, and I'm quoting here, selling its virtual government to consumers everywhere. Now, I know Estonia to be on a map, but I'm not sure what you mean by e-government or virtual government services. So you're in the United States, I'm in Canada. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we're both wealthy, so that some number of thousands of dollars is not is no object to us. So what does one get from Estonia in terms of virtual services?
Well, I don't know if this is a reference that Canadians will necessarily get, but um, you, in a simple sense, Estonia is the Delaware of the 21st century, in the sense that in the U.S., three-quarters of all corporations, I believe, are incorporated in Delaware, even though it's, in terms of land mass, the smallest state in the country. But because of the structure of Delaware's corporation laws, and this is something that goes back to the 19th century and was essentially a business move on the part of the state. Um, it's a very attractive place to incorporate, and so the Fortune 500 is basically located, in a sense, entirely in the state of Delaware, even though it has they have virtually no physical presence there, and Estonia has come up with more or less the same model, based on blockchain. So it's into the cutting edge technologies and so forth. But the basic idea is that they've created a thing called e-residency. It's really pitched at businesses, but uh, the first e-resident, I'm blanking on the name of the person, but it was a person. It was a writer who became the first official Estonian e-writer, so e-resident. So you can do this as kind of a solo operator. But the basic idea is that you can establish a virtual presence in Estonia, and for business purposes become a an Estonian, without ever setting foot there, without having any physical presence there. Now, the reason you would want to do that is because that then gets you inside the umbrella of the EU, and you can have a factory manufacturing latex gloves in Taiwan, say, and you're running your business out of Toronto, and you want to ship to Germany without having to pay any sorts of tariffs. Well, you can do that because you're now an Estonian, even though you've never been to Estonia. You don't have a factory in Estonia. It's all virtual, but you're an Estonian, so you can now sell into the EU. And as a result of that, uh, like Delaware, Estonia can build a profitable business services sector off of that for all the people who want to be serviced. That's the surface reality. When I first heard about this was an article that quoted a guy named Sim Sikut, who was the advisor to either the president or the prime minister at that point. He's gone out on his own now. Very interesting guy. Um, and he was basically the champion of this e-government sort of thing that they started in Estonia. And he was quoted in the piece as saying, well, this isn't a threat to the nation state as we know it today. This doesn't disrupt anything. And I read that and I said, that's not true. This is the beginning of the end of the nation state for all the reasons that are talked about in Democracy Disrupted. And I wrote a piece about that. I wrote an article about that led to the Estonian government eventually inviting me to come over and spend some time there. And I got to meet Sim Sikut, and I recited this to him, and they said, I wrote this piece and said, what you said isn't true. And I said, it's not true, is it? And he kind of laughed. He said, no, it's not true. This is at least the beginning of the unraveling to some extent of the nation state as we know it. But in Estonia, we're a small state, and we have to watch out for the larger countries, and we don't want to be big-footed, so we try not to have large ambitions, and we're just trying to focus um, basically this business regulation niche, and getting businesses to be Estonian in a virtual way. But eventually, governments will decide that they can deliver health insurance this way. I mean, Canada could be offering its national health insurance plan to Americans who would probably be clamoring for it, cut out the requirement that you got to live in Winnipeg for 6 months out of the year in order to qualify, and instead just go virtual and pump out the national health insurance plan to anybody anywhere who wants to buy it. And countries like Estonia, will start doing that and offering other sorts of government services, basically long distance and virtually. And there are lots of services that governments provide, if you think about it, that can be provided that way, in just the way that, as we talked about earlier, the hotel and the auto industries have gone virtual, and things start breaking apart in that fashion. Well, once you could buy your healthcare plan from Canada, your business regulation services from Estonia, your social security plan from a consortium of governments in the Caribbean who offer this amongst themselves, and you start basically buying your government in pieces from whichever government you want. There's no reason you have to buy that from a government. You and I can start a business to provide those services, and people can buy those services from us. And it's a long discussion, obviously, but if you think it through, there's hardly anything that we think of government doing that can't be jobbed out and broken up in that way and delivered, thanks to the technologies today, in a non-territorial fashion. Once you start doing that, you are in fact talking about the end of the nation state, at least as we know it.
A lot of government services work because of their mandatory nature. So you mentioned pension plans. Well, pension plans work because it's taken off the top, like federal, like the Canada Pension Plan, or the ones run by governments. I as a worker, I never see that money. I mean, one could argue that we'd just be better off if the employer is taking $100 a month, say, or $500 a month, and putting it into a national government run pension plan. I would be, the workers would be better off if that cash were just given to the worker. But it's mandatory by law, and it's put aside because the argument goes that sometimes people are irrational, and it's the forced savings. They discount things in the future for right now. There might be some cross subsidization where wealthier people put more in than they get out, and poorer people get more out than they put in, and it balances. But that only works if everyone participates. And you're talking about health insurance. Well, it's not just in Canada. The health coverage is not just that it's like an insurance plan. The government runs the entire health system. So doctors and hospitals and so on. These are all these prices are all paid for single payer by the government. So if I break my arm, I go to the hospital, I get a cast. There's zero out of pocket for me, but that only works because it's covered nationally, and all aspects of it. If you were to break apart a single element of it, the system, like if you take out a foundational piece, the system will collapse. In principle, sure, you can have every single piece being run by a different party, but then you won't have a system anymore. At least it'll be completely unrecognizable compared to the systems that exist today. So I don't think it's quite as simple as you're describing. If it's going to happen, it's going to be a complete reorganization of these social institutions. Do you think that's what's going to happen?
Yes, that is exactly my point. Um, but I think I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle than you. Um, Politically, I would agree with the argument you're making. You're making essentially a normative argument that this is the way things should be. This is a better system. Let's have it this way. I'm not disagreeing with that. Now, most of my friends are on the progressive side of the spectrum, and I think, at least until recently, I think most people would have described me as being on that side of the spectrum, and they get very upset when I say this sort of thing, because what they'll tend to say is, well, you're calling for the destruction of everything we hold dear, and that's not my argument at all. My argument is quite the opposite of it. It's that it is being destroyed by these forces. It will be destroyed by these forces. And we need to start thinking ahead about, if you want to live in a society where people help each other, because that leads to a better society, you're going to have to do it in a different way in the middle of the 21st century, just like we do it in a different way now from how it was done in the 13th century. And nobody thinks that's bad. I mean, that's the way the world works. The world changes, and we adapt and do things. And nobody's yearning for the return of the 13th century. I don't think in 50 or 100 years people are going to be yearning for the return of the 1950s. I just don't. And when I said before that I don't think progressivism has been progressive for a while, I mean, I think this is why we're thinking about a technological and social structure that isn't going to exist and is already fading. So you need to think about what that looks like. Now, why does that happen in the context of what you just described with the Canadian healthcare system, which is wonderful and works beautifully, and you can't take any of the pieces away? And maybe this will happen slower in Canada because the Canadian healthcare system is great and everybody loves it. But if you look at most places in the world,
It's not without its own issues.
most places in the world, people aren't crazy about just about anything about government. And um, there's this quote from Otto von Bismarck that I've always loved, where he says, "When the end of the world comes, I want to be in Mecklenburg, because everything happens there 30 years later." And I've always said that's what government is like. And I'm not anti-government. I've spent most of my career in government or advising people in government. I think government's an important part of society, but it's got its problems. And I think it's safe to say that when the end of the world comes, it's going to come 30 years later in government, because that's just how things happen. They happen slower. And the way that the internet has undermined incumbents in every major industry, particularly information-centric industries, is going to hit government. And it became kind of the thing to talk 20 years ago about how, the internet's really going to change government. We're going to have, you're going to be able to go on a website to order your, whatever government service you want. And I just kind of roll my eyes at that. That's not how the internet has changed the lodging industry. Now you can make reservations on the internet instead of on the phone. It's totally disrupted it, and it's going to totally disrupt government in the same way. And my basic thesis on government is that it can resist change for longer than most industries. Things happen more slowly there because you were talking about the compulsory nature of things, and governments have jails and guns that most industries don't have and get to use on their customers to retain them. But eventually, even in the most repressive regime, if you're not giving people value for their money, they're going to rebel against the government just as much as they're going to rebel against a bad company. And governments get pressured to deliver better services. Now, when technology makes it possible to come up with services that are like those being delivered by government and do it better, at some point, people are going to say, why am I paying my taxes? You can't keep making me pay for a bad system when I can get things cheaper. And in a lot of ways, I can't speak to Canada, but, public education in this country has been severely undermined by the rise, for various reasons, of people wanting and having the ability to send their children to private schools. And when they start doing that in large numbers, they start deciding they don't want to pay for the public school system. Why should I pay for that? I don't have kids in it. And you see an underfunded educational system as a result of that. And the technology basically makes it easier to leave, because you don't have to physically leave to leave your service area any longer. And over time, that will put pressure on government because of competitors like Estonia, or like the business that you and I are going to start to deliver a better healthcare system, that will undermine people's desire to pay for the bad governmental system. And governments are going to have to compete more. And the more they start doing that, the less you're going to be able to tell the difference between what's a government and what's a business.
Right. Let me draw an analogy here, and tell me if sorry, because what you're describing sounds a lot. It sounds like people are going to do what the shipping industry has already done, and like container ships are like the current state. The way it is today for container ships is that you've got a company which was founded and operates in country A, but its official headquarters are in country B, or Delaware, say, right? Because and and it has a crew from country C, and the ship itself goes from country D to country E while while the ship itself is flying the flag of country F.
Right.
And it's all essentially regulatory arbitrage. Where are the rules for this piece of my shipping business most favorable to me? And so Is
Yeah.
it a German company? Is it an American company? Is it an Egyptian company? Like is it a Panamanian company? Who knows, right? Like it depends on which aspect of the business you're talking about. So is this something that you see happening with people and their citizenship, where they're a citizen of one country for one thing, but getting services from another government in another part of the world for something else, and everything just becomes a mosaic like that?
Absolutely. And I'd say a couple of things on that. Number one, that's not entirely new. Uh, People throughout history have changed their residence for business and regulatory reasons. So, I mean, you were talking about flags of convenience. That's not a new phenomenon. That's been around for centuries. Um, and basically, my argument would be once you start shipping things by hitting a button on your computer and it shows up my service is exported to you in Toronto instantly from hundreds of miles away because we're trading in an economy that's becoming largely non-physical. Uh, the this flag of convenience phenomenon becomes applicable to more and more of the economy and more things. And part of what's emerging in technologies today, um, take one of the more extreme examples, um, uh, guns, which is a big issue in my country. I think less so in yours. But there's this 3D printing technology that allows you to, basically atom by atom build anything from scratch, including, eventually we'll be building living organisms by printing them. Houses are already being printed, dot by dot. Well, gun technology is advancing in that direction very quickly. Um, uh, I'm trying to remember where there was the big shooting recently where it was a homemade gun. You're going to see more and more of that, and government's ability to regulate guns the way that lots of people in the U.S. are agitating for is going to be severely undermined by that. But when you get to the point where everything can be printed dot by dot, basically, that I can send you a gun design or I can send you a house design from 800 miles away to you and have it printed out, you're starting to get something that's getting awful close to Star Trek. But we're getting there. So you're talking about physical goods being able to be shipped, quote unquote, and even the non-physical goods constituting the vast bulk of the economy. The economy is going to be flowing.
So physical goods are going to become, you would just send the blueprints. Like if you want me to read something, you just send me the essay, and if I want a physical copy, I print it out. And you're saying that like these 3D printers are going to become so ubiquitous, there'll be one around the corner, if not in every house, and so it's just the information that gets shipped.
It will be in every house. I mean, another aspect of Estonia is that they're ahead on everything in technology. They start kids at like the age of 3 on computer coding. I went to a classroom where there were a bunch of kindergartners creating their own robots and stuff. And I mean, some kids do that here, but it's like every kid is trained on that. They had a 3D. This was. I'm trying to think when I went there 5 years ago. They had a 3D printer in the classroom. They're like these 5-year-olds are printing things out. It's going to be in every home, and it's going to be every part of the economy. And as everything gets virtualized, it's a lot harder to tell a geographical government that I'm sorry. It's a lot harder for the geographical government to say, "I'm sorry, I have control over everything you do." Well, no, you don't. You're not going to have that kind of control. Now, the problem, which you started hinting at with your question about the Canadian healthcare system, is, well, gee, isn't what you're saying really scary and everything's going to fall apart? Well, yes, actually, that is kind of scary and everything's going to fall apart. But we need to start thinking about what do we construct in its place, because we can't live in a world ultimately where 8 billion people do whatever they want, create their own reality, and smash up against each other. You need governance in some sense to have society function, even if it's not going to be government in the way we've thought about it for the last few hundred years.
Yeah, and that leads me to something else I really wanted to talk to you about, because you, to some extent today, and even more down the road, and I'm quoting you here, you do not have to be a part of anything with which you disagree, and that's referring to to the online virtual world. And I mean, I think that's absolutely true. But no matter how much time we spend online, we're still physical being excuse me, we're still physical beings with bodies that move around in in the world. So what if my lifestyle is celebrated in my online community, but it's illegal in yours? And just to give one example, let's say that we're next door neighbors. So let's say I'm gay, and you are a certain strain of fundamentalist Christian or Hindu or Muslim. Uh, do we need to instill a widespread acceptance of a live and let live, or you do you attitude or worldview? And in a world where everyone chooses their online communities, how can we do that? Because you have priorities that differ than
Right.
mine. And my lifestyle might be gravely offensive to you.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think you have just described what the political situation is in the United States today, and getting more so like that every day. And as I point out in the piece, I think that that is essentially an explanation, or at least a partial explanation of the what happened in January 6th in the United States. It is becoming possible to live in your own reality and make sure that the rest of the world's reality conforms to that reality. And that's something of a problem, because there are other people who live in a different reality from that. It's not just that uh, to use the kind of colloquialisms that are used in the United States nowadays, that red Americans and blue Americans have different views. They are living in wholly different realities. They live within different information ecosystems, and believe that the world is completely different from how the other person believes that it is. And to some extent, that's liberating. You can believe that Joe Biden won the election, or you can believe that Donald Trump won the election, and the country is basically split on what that reality is, not on what it should be, but what it is. So that's great. You can believe your own thing. On the other hand, some people think that they were stopping a coup by seizing the Capitol on January 6th, and other people think that was the coup. And somebody's got to be right and somebody's got to be wrong on that, because somebody is actually seizing the physical capital. So, what does that mean for a world where we live together? And that's why, I think we're going through a tough time for the next maybe a decade, until stuff like this sorts out, because we're going from a world of one type to a world that I think will be very different, where you will be able to go online for the most part, and the vast bulk of what you want from government, let alone from what you want for your lifestyle, is going to be obtainable online, separately from what the person next door does and lives. And I talk a lot about my next door neighbor, who has more or less diametrically opposed political views from mine. Now that's becoming increasingly rare, which is part of how things will sort out. To the extent that you have to get along with your neighbors and make neighborly decisions, people have already largely sorted themselves geographically in this country, and they're doing the same in other countries, although I don't think quite to the extreme that Americans have. So it's actually rare to find a situation like me and my next door neighbor, where we really don't seem to see anything the same way, but I mean, we get along fine. Nice guy. Well, I think 10 years from now, he's going to be able to hit a button on his computer and say, I want to join virtual Mississippi, and or virtual Texas, and I'm going to be able to hit a button on my computer and say I want to join virtual Massachusetts, and we'll just go along fine on most things which we've been talking about. There are services that are not geographically tied and can be dispersed in that fashion. There are some things that can't be. We have on-site sewer in my township, but someday we're going to go to a municipal sewer line. I think that's inevitable. And when that happens, Lance and I are going to have to jointly make decisions, along with other people in our township, about where that sewer line runs and how it intersects with our property, and how we each have to, or get to, depending on how you look at it, pay for it. Those kinds of things that are inherently physical, I think, will remain with territorial governments as we know them. But for things that don't have to be territorial, they're not gonna be.
So government is going to be kind of reduced to a almost like the libertarian ideal where basic infrastructure and ensuring contracts and rule of law are enforced. Is that kind of the vision that you're seeing?
No, I'm going to object to one word in what you said.
Libertarian.
No, no, no,
Oh,
no.
okay.
Government. You started
Okay.
by saying so government's going to be reduced to this. No, I don't think that at all. I think that territorial governments, as we think of them today and have thought of them for a couple hundred years, will be
Hmm.
reduced to doing that. But we will need to have governance structures in just about everything, or people can't function together. Once you get two people or more, you have to have something that resembles rules, rule making, and decision making, and that's governance, if not government. And I think we will have governments, but they're not going to be, uh, uh, Westphalian nation states per se, except on a very localized level. We're going to have, business government the way Estonia has business government that you're going to be able to subscribe to, even though you're in Canada, and lots of other services like that. So some things are going to be localized and tied to geography, and most of the world simply isn't, because most of the world simply isn't going to be tied to geography anymore.
I want to challenge you on one of your key points.
Sure.
So you write that services and products previously bundled together can be, and thus eventually must be, unbundled and acquired or sold separately. And then elsewhere on the same theme, you wrote of one of the more transformative technologies in recent decades is the shipping container. But shipping has massively consolidated. So globally, there's only I think like two or three shipping companies of any real size, and it's not just that industry. The trend in the past few decades has been massively towards monopoly or oligopoly. Almost every sector of the economy today is more concentrated than it was 5 years ago, and that statement has been true at 5 year segments for probably 20 plus years. The Economist wrote last year that on average, market share in the top four firms in each sector had risen from 26% to 32% in 600 out of 900 sectors they looked at, and they had grown more concentrated. And I'm just and without looking at all the data, if I just think about airlines, telecoms, agriculture, tech firms, shipping, beer, banking, insurance, more and more, what we're seeing is a lot of buyouts and fewer larger players. So I'm not seeing the disaggregation that you talk about in Democracy Disrupted, and I want to invite you to defend that point or correct me where I've made some error in my analysis.
Sure. I do think I addressed this a little bit in the piece, but um, before coming back and addressing that directly, I want to expand it some by
Okay.
analogizing that everything that you just said about the concentration of industry and economic power uh, is basically the same argument that most people make today about political power, in that the state is becoming more centralized and powerful, and that we're on the verge of living in an authoritarian hellscape, as opposed to some libertarian paradise or something. That authoritarianism is on the march all over, and it's conquering. And um, I I would dispute that too, but I think that you see both of these phenomena going on simultaneously: the aggregation and the disaggregation, or the concentration and the dispersion. Um, there there are at the same time that there's obviously a lot of movement towards authoritarianism in lots of places around the world. There are also very healthy democratization movements, and the increasing ability of people to fight for and achieve democracy. There's a lot of inspiring struggles for democracy going on around the world right now. It's not like it's all one way or the other. And I'd say the same with the economy, that you know, the you look at, I mean, essentially, the economy is all being transferred to a couple of platforms that, I think this is Jeff Bezos's ambition, that eventually the entire economy, the entire market is in fact, on Amazon. And that's where all economic activity transpires. And it would be the equivalent of if you were living hundreds of years ago in some isolated area, and once a week everybody goes to the market town to transact and trade and so forth, so that all economic activity occurred in this marketplace, which every society has had. Um, if somebody got to own the marketplace, now, in most places, that marketplace evolved into being a public function that was government owned for obvious reasons, because you don't want to live in a world where one person owns the economy. And yeah, in a lot of ways, we're headed in that direction, and I think that that's very troublesome. But at the same time, and this goes back to the argument that no technology is inherently one way or the other. It can be used in both ways. These technologies are in fact decentralizing a lot of the activity. At the same time that Amazon is uh, moving to try to own the entire market, essentially, it's easier than ever to start your own business and to get into things, and things are disaggregating. The taxi monopoly in New York City is going to be destroyed by Uber, as it is in most places, and governments are fighting back on that. But once you have a ride hailing app, there's only so long you can keep that in place. And one of the things that means is that, if you want to travel by car, you no longer need to own a car. You can get 15 minutes. I can get 15 minutes worth of your car to take me someplace. So I don't need to own one any longer. I don't need to um, I don't need to own a place that I'm going to stay any longer. But instead of renting a room from Hyatt, I'm going to rent a room in your house. I mean, people are already doing that. When I talk about how everything is being broken up and splintered and unbundled, that's the case. Time is being unbundled. Physical goods are being unbundled. It's easier for people to get exactly what they want, when they want it, where they want it, how they want it. And, in a lot of ways, that is a hyper democratizing world. I'm not disputing what you're saying about the growing economic concentration. And I don't have a total answer to that, other than that I think that the world is going to have to look very different 20 years from now, in all the ways we've discussed, and in other ways too. I mean, I don't know how much we're going to wind up touching on global warming in this conversation, but that's on a lot of people's minds, obviously. And you can deny it for so long, but at some point, I mean, already that's changing lots of industries. It's changing the shipping industry. It's changing the insurance industry. At some point, you can't ignore facts. And all industries as we know it, including you read earlier the second sentence you read about capitalism and the usurpation of value. That is going to have to change, because as Herb Simon, who was Richard Nixon's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, once famously said, something that can't go on forever won't. And there are certain economic tendencies in the world today that simply cannot go on forever.
Right, but the question is, how much damage is going to be wrought before what's happening.
And how do we make that change before we have that kind of damage?
Exactly. So let's end on this topic. There's so much in your essay that we've been, even though we've been talking for close to an hour, we're not going to get to extraterritoriality. We're not going to get to the changes in cyber wars. We're not going to be talking about what you a term that I think you've coined called mutually assured survival. But I do want to talk about this new era that you're describing, and the collective action problem. And if everyone's able to say, well, I'm only doing this piece, and climate change is someone else's problem, and everyone has that attitude, then no one does anything to address a civilizational threat to our species. So, can you provide your insights on how what I've just described might not come to pass, especially in a world where everyone has their own information ecosystem? As Upton Sinclair famously wrote, it is very difficult to get a man to understand a thing when his salary depends on him not understanding it.
Yes. Um, Again, this is a huge question. It'll be hard to compress this answer down, but um, in a lot of ways, every question you've asked, including this one, comes back to what an economist or a political scientist would call the public goods question.
Sure, I called it collective action, but public goods is just as good a way to describe it.
Same thing, basically. And that goes to the example I gave of uh, my neighbor hitting a button, because it'll be that easy now, and choose to opt out of what I'm going to opt into, or I suppose he would see it as I'm opting out of what he would choose to opt into. Um, and once you reach that point where you know the rationale for modern government is you can't have people do that. You have to have something that collectively says, I'm sorry, we need to have a certain number of public parks for health reasons and other reasons, recreation reasons, have a better society. So you don't get to say you're not going to pay for the park because you're a beneficiary of it. So we're going to make you pay your taxes. What happens in a world where the government can't do that anymore in lots of ways? Because you can, to take the example to an extreme, you can just opt out of anything you want to opt out to and do it by hitting a button.
I don't own a car. I'm not going to pay for roads. I'm a pacifist. I refuse to pay for any military spending, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I think that we will evolve into a situation somewhat like that. And if you don't have a road, if you don't have a car, this won't be a problem for you. If you do have a car, it's going to be technologically impossible for you in a few years to drive on a road without paying for it. You'll be paying for it in a different way, through the thing on your dashboard instead of through your taxes. But you will if you're using the public good, you will have to pay for it. The issue becomes the people who are surreptitiously using the public good, basically the free riders. Like, I'm not going to pay any taxes for the Environmental Protection Agency. Ha ha, you can't stop me from breathing the cleaner air. You suckers pay for that, but I'm not going to. Well, I actually think we'll get to a technological point where that's not going to be an issue either. Thanks to Fitbits that monitor everything in your bloodstream nowadays, you're going to you're going to be able to pay or not pay for clean air or dirty air at some point in the not so distant future. But that's a real subset of the problem. The ultimate answer to the question you asked, the answer that I have, and it's it starts with the fact that I can't predict how the future is going to come out. As I try to say in the article, there are ways that I think it can go that could be really good, and I try to point those out. But there are obviously ways in which it can go that could be really bad, and I think most people today think it's headed in a really bad direction. We're going to have to make a decision about which way we go on that. But my belief is, and if I'm wrong, I don't know what to do about us, basically. But my belief is that the right answer eventually prevails. That a society that where everybody thinks they don't have to cooperate with anybody else, they can get their way, and if they don't get their way, they're going to kill their neighbor. That kind of society is not likely to last for very long. A society that believes we should come together and invest in our fellow human beings. That if we give other people good health and good education and opportunities and clean air and other things that I want to have in my life, that I create a better society by doing that for them and for me, and we all do better. And there's a reason why not a lot of libertarians are moving to Somalia, which is an example of a place that doesn't have a government. And if you think it would be a paradise, you should move there. but I don't see a lot of Americans moving to Somalia.
Right. It's the difference between Mad Max and the Star Trek Federation of Planets.
Right. Instead, what we do is sit around here and complain about our taxes because we don't see any benefit from it. But the benefit is that we live in a country with infrastructure. We live in a country where most people do get at least a pretty good education, despite the faults in our education system. And an increasing number of Americans, I mean, you're up to about 40% of the younger generation now, are getting a college education, which would have been inconceivable 50 years ago. And it's because we are making investments and have a better economy and have a freer society than a lot of other places because we do make these investments. And I think that when the government's ability to get you to pay for supporting these things changes from the point of a barrel to the button on your computer, and what that government, whether it's a government that we as we think of it today, or whether it's Estonia, or whether it's your and my company or whatever, but if that government offers those kinds of social investments and social interactions that are necessary for rules to make an economy work, ways of living so that we're living in harmony and not killing each other. The entity that offers that, the society, whether it's physical or virtual, that comes together around those things, I believe is going to be more stable, more successful, wealthier, happier, healthier, and that model will prevail. If that's not true, if we're doomed to a future of Planet of the Apes or something because we're so darn stupid, well, then I don't know what other answer there is. I am optimistic in the sense that there's a famous quote attributed to Winston Churchill, which apparently he never actually said, but a lot of people will quote this, that about the United States of America: you can always count on the United States of America to do the right thing after it's tried every other alternative. I, I think that whether that's true of the U.S. or not, it's true of human beings. The main question is whether we're going to get there before we destroy the entire planet. But if we can avoid that, I think that at least in the long run, despite what Keynes said about in the long run we're all dead, at least our children won't be. And I think they will be living in a world where it's clear that the entities that provide the kinds of services that help a society prosper are the ones that will in fact prosper and will beat out other models in the long run. In the short run, I'm a little bit less optimistic.
Yeah, well, let's hope we reach the long run sooner rather than later, and minimize the extent of human misery in the interim.
That's the hope, and that's why it's important to have discussions about this. We need to start thinking about, this is where we're headed. This is the way to get to a better place where we could be headed, rather than sitting around thinking, let's stick to outdated mental frames about what the world is like and what it looks like, because we don't want to deal with the fact that what's coming is going to be very different, and that's scary. Well, yes, what's coming is going to be very different. It's scary. Let's make it better.
Yeah. So I would encourage everyone to read Eric Schneur's essay, Democracy Disrupted. I'll link to it in the show notes. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
No, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.